Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be tackling something, it's called affective forecasting, but really it's something we all kind of do naturally.
Yeah, it
And
is.
we're going to be looking at it particularly related to the autistic experience.
Exactly.
We're going to be drawing on some content from the Cheap ABA blog.
Great blog.
Yeah, they've got a whole bunch of really interesting content.
They really do.
But I think what's particularly interesting about this deep dive is we're really getting a glimpse into that internal experience of what it's like to be autistic, which isn't always something that you can just see from the outside.
Absolutely. And that's what's so fascinating about this topic.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not just looking at outward behaviors. We're trying to understand how autistic individuals process emotions and anticipate future feelings, their inner world.
Okay, so let's break down this affective forecasting thing.
Sure.
So basically, affective forecasting is like our ability to predict how we're going to feel in the future, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Like when you're looking forward to a vacation and you can almost feel the sand between your toes or the excitement of trying new foods.
Yeah.
Picturing those positive emotions.
Oh, yeah, or like being nervous about a presentation at work.
Right. Picturing yourself stumbling over your words or the audience looking bored.
Yeah.
That's your brain engaging in effective forecasting.
Yeah.
Trying to anticipate those feelings.
So it's like our internal prediction system for feelings.
Precisely.
Hmm.
It's about creating a mental simulation of future emotional states. And like the Cheap ABA blog points out, this system can work differently for autistic individuals.
And this is where things get really interesting. So the blog dives into the reasons behind this. And it all comes back to some pretty core aspects of the autistic experience, right? First, we've got emotional regulation. The blog suggests that if you're having trouble understanding your current emotional state, figuring out exactly how you feel right now, it becomes that much harder to predict how you'll feel in the future.
It's like trying to navigate to a destination without knowing your starting point. If you're not grounded in your present emotions, it's tough to anticipate where those emotions might lead you.
And then there's the whole sensory processing piece, something the blog really emphasizes.
Oh, absolutely. Sensory input plays a huge role.
They suggest that for some autistic individuals, overstimulation from the environment can really throw those predictions off.
It's like, imagine you're trying to predict your mood at a concert. If you're highly sensitive to loud noises, will you be able to enjoy the music, or will it become overwhelming and lead to anxiety?
It's like your senses are getting bombarded, and it makes it so much harder to anticipate how you'll react emotionally.
Exactly. And this can make navigating everyday situations pretty stressful.
For sure. It's like you're constantly on edge, never knowing when your senses might get overloaded and how that'll impact your mood.
Right. And then on top of that, we have to consider social cognition.
Ah, yes, the social piece.
The blog points out that autistic individuals might interpret social cues differently or struggle to predict how others will react in social situations.
Yeah, so it's not just about understanding your own internal world, but also trying to decipher the social world around you.
Precisely. If you're unsure how someone will respond to you, it makes it even trickier to predict your own feelings in that interaction. Will you feel comfortable, anxious, misunderstood? It adds another layer of complexity to effective forecasting.
So it's like trying to predict the weather while the wind is constantly changing direction?
A great analogy. It's no wonder effective forecasting can be such a challenge. But here's the good news. The Cheap ABA blog doesn't just leave us hanging with these challenges. They offer some concrete strategies for improving effective forecasting skills.
Okay, so they give us some hope.
Yes. And one of the most powerful techniques they talk about is emotional labeling.
Okay, what is that?
Basically, it's about putting words to your feelings. Instead of just feeling generally bad, you take a moment to identify the specific emotion you're experiencing. Maybe it's sadness, frustration, anger, or anxiety.
So instead of just saying, I feel bad, you'd say, I'm feeling anxious about this presentation.
Exactly. By being more precise with your emotional vocabulary, you gain a better understanding of your internal state, which makes it easier to anticipate how those emotions might play out in different situations.
I love that. And it makes sense. By becoming more aware of those subtle differences in our emotions, we can start to see patterns and maybe even predict those emotional storms before they hit.
Precisely. And then once you have a better handle on your emotional landscape, you can start using tools and techniques to navigate those tricky situations. And that's where sensory regulation comes in.
Oh yeah, sensory regulation is super important.
The blog suggests things like using noise-canceling headphones in loud environments, or having a weighted blanket for calming touch. It's about creating a personalized toolkit to manage sensory input.
So it's about having those strategies in place to help regulate those sensory experiences and gain more control over your emotional responses, which ultimately helps with effective forecasting.
Exactly. And when it comes to those social situations that can sometimes feel like minefields, the blog recommends social skills training.
Okay, interesting. So like what kind of things?
Things like learning to recognize and interpret subtle social cues like body language and tone of voice. It's about providing a framework for understanding those often unspoken rules of social interaction.
So it's about giving people the tools to sort of decode those social signals, which can help reduce anxiety and increase confidence in social situations.
Absolutely. And when you feel more confident and prepared, you're more likely to make accurate predictions about how those interactions will go and how you'll feel within them.
It's like having a map instead of just wandering around lost and confused.
Exactly. But beyond those tools and techniques, the blog also highlights the importance of something we can all benefit from: mindfulness and self-reflection.
Ah, yes, taking the time to really pay attention to our inner world.
It's about observing your own emotional patterns. Maybe you notice that you always feel a surge of anxiety before public speaking, or that certain social situations tend to trigger feelings of overwhelm. By paying attention to those patterns, you can start to anticipate those feelings and develop coping mechanisms.
It's like becoming a detective of your own emotions, figuring out the clues that can help you predict future feelings and navigate those challenging situations more effectively.
That's a great way to put it. It's about understanding the why behind your emotional responses, which can be incredibly empowering.
So we've got emotional labeling, sensory regulation, social skills training, and mindfulness. Those are some pretty solid tools for tackling the challenges of effective forecasting. But here's where the cheap ABA blog throws in a bit of a curveball. They talk about all these strategies for improvement, but they also make a point that this skill can vary a lot from person to person, even within the autistic community.
Right, and that's an important nuance, I think. Sometimes we talk about autism as if it's a one-size-fits-all experience,
Right.
but the reality is much more complex and diverse.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. It's not about presenting a single answer, but rather about exploring those different ways that autistic individuals experience and navigate the world.
And it leads us to a question for you, our listener.
Yeah.
What factors do you think might influence how good someone is at predicting their own emotions?
It's a question that goes beyond just a diagnosis, right? It gets to the core of how we all experience and manage our emotions. You know, it's amazing how much ground the cheap ABA blog covers.
Yeah, they really do.
It's not just about effective forecasting. They go into all these different areas.
They do. It's impressive.
Like, I was really struck by their series on religious trauma syndrome.
Oh, yeah. That's a tough one.
It's not something you hear about every day, but it can have such a profound impact on autistic individuals.
Absolutely. And it often gets overlooked or misunderstood.
Yeah, the blog explains how religious trauma, or RTS, can come from experiences within organized religion that end up causing psychological harm.
Right. It's about those experiences that lead to negative mental health outcomes.
And for autistic individuals, those harmful experiences can be tied to the very things they struggle with: most social expectations, sensory overload, rigid adherence to rules.
Exactly. Imagine being part of a religious community that emphasizes social conformity and strict adherence to rituals. But you're autistic and you find those things incredibly challenging.
Right, it's like a constant mismatch between your needs and the expectations of your environment.
And that can create a lot of internal conflict.
It's like being told over and over again that who you are is somehow wrong or bad.
The blog gives a specific example of autistic individuals raised in the Jehovah's Witness community, where there's a big emphasis on door-to-door preaching.
Oh, wow.
That kind of social interaction can be really stressful for anyone, but for someone who's autistic and finds social situations draining, it can be completely overwhelming.
And if those feelings of overwhelm and anxiety aren't dealt with,
Right.
they can turn into something much more serious.
Exactly. And the interesting thing is that the blog connects this back to effective forecasting.
Oh, how so? Well, they suggest that if you've been repeatedly told that your natural way of being is wrong, it can make it hard to trust your own feelings and predictions.
Oh, I see. So you're not only struggling with the emotional impact of those negative experiences, but it also undermines your confidence in your ability to understand and navigate your own emotional world.
Exactly. It's like a double whammy. And the blog stresses the importance of support and understanding for autistic individuals who've experienced religious trauma.
Yeah, that's so important.
They encourage seeking therapy, connecting with supportive communities, and practicing self-care.
It's a good reminder that even though these experiences can be really tough, healing is possible.
Absolutely. And speaking of tough experiences, the Cheap ABA blog also has a great series on masking that really got me thinking,
Yeah, that one was fascinating.
particularly for autistic women.
Right. The blog talks about how autistic women often learn to suppress their autistic traits from a very young age, and they blend in so well that their autism might not even be noticed. Yeah, they become masters of camouflage. But the blog really digs into the costs of that constant masking.
Right, because it might seem like a good thing on the surface.
Yeah, you're fitting in, you're adapting.
But it can be really exhausting.
It's incredibly draining. It's like you're constantly monitoring and adjusting your behavior, trying to meet those neurotypical expectations.
And that can lead to all sorts of problems, like emotional exhaustion, identity struggles, increased risk of anxiety and depression.
Exactly. It's like you're living a double life trying to be someone you're not. And that takes a toll.
It's so important to remember that masking isn't about being fake.
No, not at all.
It's a way to survive in a world that's not always accepting of differences.
Right. It's a coping mechanism.
And the blog makes a great point about challenging those societal expectations that make masking necessary in the first place.
Absolutely. We need to create a world where autistic individuals feel safe and accepted for who they are.
A world that celebrates neurodiversity.
Exactly. And one of the best ways to do that is by amplifying autistic voices.
And the Cheap ABA blog does a fantastic job of that.
They do. They have a whole section dedicated to personal stories and perspectives from autistic individuals.
It's one thing to read about autism from a clinical perspective,
Yeah.
but it's so powerful to hear directly from autistic people about their lived experiences.
It adds a whole new dimension to the conversation.
One story that stuck with me was by an autistic woman who wrote about the challenges of romantic relationships.
Oh, yeah, that was a poignant one.
She talked about feeling like she was constantly having to explain herself to her partner,
Right.
which was both exhausting and made her feel really alone.
It highlights the need for open communication and understanding in relationships.
And finding partners who not only accept neurodiversity, but embrace it.
Absolutely. And that same spirit of acceptance runs through the entire Cheap ABA blog.
Yeah, they tackle some really tough topics.
They do.
But there's always that thread of hope and resilience.
Right, emphasizing the power of community and self-advocacy.
It's a good reminder that even though there are challenges, there's also so much strength and beauty in the autistic experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing and valuing those unique perspectives and talents.
It's fascinating how the Cheap ABA blog digs into some of the less talked about aspects of autism.
Yeah, they really do.
Like they have this whole section on sensory sensitivities,
Right.
which can have such a big impact on daily life.
Huge.
You know, they go way beyond just like, not liking loud noises or bright lights. They get into all those little nuances.
The complexities.
Yeah, like I remember reading that post about the fear of button zippers and Velcro.
Oh, yeah.
And it was like a light bulb moment for me.
It's true.
I'd never thought of those as like sensory triggers before.
Yeah, and it's easy to overlook those things until you hear from autistic individuals about how those sensations can be like really intense. For some, it's like a constant itch you can't scratch.
Yeah.
Or a buzzing in your ear that never goes away.
And it's not just discomfort either. The blog talks about how those sensory experiences can lead to all sorts of things like avoidance, behaviors, meltdowns, or even social isolation.
Yeah, if they're not understood and accommodated.
Imagine trying to focus on a conversation while someone's tapping their pen.
Yeah.
Or those fluorescent lights are buzzing.
It's so hard to filter that out.
And it makes even simple interactions feel overwhelming.
Right, like you're on sensory overload.
Yeah, and the blog really stresses the importance of validating those experiences, like recognizing that those sensitivities are real and significant.
Not just being picky.
Exactly.
It's about creating environments that are sensitive to those needs.
Right.
Whether it's dimming the lights, offering sensory tools, or just respecting someone's need to take a break.
And that same idea of understanding and accommodation goes for communication styles, too.
Absolutely.
The blog has a lot to say about how autistic individuals communicate.
Yeah, they really challenge that traditional view of communication.
Like they point out that it's not just about spoken words. It can be body language visual aids, stimming.
All sorts of things.
And the key is recognizing that there's no one right way to communicate. It's about meeting people where they are.
Exactly. Understanding their individual communication style and adapting our own communication to fit that.
Instead of trying to force everyone into the same mold.
Right. Create space for those differences.
And the blog gives some great advice on how to do that.
Yeah. Like what?
Things like using clear and concise language.
Oh, that's a good one.
giving people time to process information,
Right.
being patient with those communication differences.
It's about building those bridges of understanding.
For sure. And all of this becomes even more important when you think about the challenges autistic individuals often face in finding jobs.
Oh, yeah, that's a huge issue.
The blog talks about the discrimination, the
Mm-hmm.
lack of accommodations.
Unrealistic expectations.
It's tough to read about those experiences.
It is.
But I appreciate how the blog advocates for change.
Yeah, they really do.
They focus on the strengths and talents that autistic individuals bring to the workplace.
Right, like their attention to detail,
Yeah.
problem-solving skills.
Thinking outside the box.
Those are all incredibly valuable assets.
It's about shifting that perspective, right?
Yeah.
From seeing autism as a deficit,
To seeing it as a different way of thinking
a form of neurodiversity.
that enriches our world.
And I think that's a perfect note to end on.
I agree.
Our deep dive into the cheap ABA blog has been really eye-opening,
It has.
and I hope it's given our listeners a new understanding of effective forecasting.
And the broader autistic experience.
If you're interested in learning more, definitely check out their blog.
So much great stuff there.
We've only scratched the surface.
We have.
But that's it for today's deep dive.
Thanks for joining us.
We'll be back soon with another topic to explore.
Until then, keep those brains buzzing.
And keep diving deep into the things that matter to you.